few years ago, I had this opportunity to bring a bunch of teenage boys on a canoe trip. We were going into the Algonquin Park, and we were going to be canoeing there, and we were going to spend a couple of nights camping out, and it was going to be such an amazing experience. I was working as a youth pastor, and I had a few young adult interns who were working with me, and they did this great job of organizing this trip, and I was so excited to do it. Now, I have a love for canoeing. I love to be out on rivers in particular. I love to be out in nature. For me, that's one of the ways that I connect with God. But at the same time, as much as I love it, as much as I love to be out on water or near water, I find it so life-giving to me, I have a fear of being out on open water, particularly lakes. I have this uneasiness of when the boat starts to shift and shake and go side to side. And it seems like you have no control. And that's what really gets me going. The idea that I have no control. I cannot control this boat. The waves, the wind, they're crashing in around me. And no matter what I do, I can't control the wind and the waves. I can just control myself in this boat. So as much as I love to do it, I also have this nervousness, this fear that goes with it when I get the opportunity to do it with people. And then when you go canoeing, maybe by yourself, or I prefer kayaking now because I'm alone and I can kind of control things a little bit better. But when you go canoeing with people, not only are you worried about the wind and the waves, you're also worrying about the people that you're with. And so as a youth pastor at the time, as I was leading with these interns and we were taking care of these 7 or 8 young teenagers, we were also concerned for their safety. And so accompanied with the excitement of going, accompanied with this opportunity these young people had that they've probably, a lot of them actually had never had before. They didn't get to go out into nature as much. There was this anxiety, this worry that anything could really happen. Of course, we signed waivers, so we couldn't be sued, but that really didn't matter. We just wanted to make sure they'd be safe. And so as we're canoeing up, I was canoeing with this young man, and everything was going fine. It was going great. And then another young man said, hey, you know what, I'd actually really like to canoe with Rob. And I thought, yeah, sure, no problem. Now this young man was a little bit less experienced than the first person I was with. And so as they're less experienced, they tend to not always know how to properly get into a boat or how to not shake a boat, essentially. And so for someone like me who had this already kind of worry, this fear of water, as much as I love it, you bring in a young person who doesn't really know what they're doing and they're shaking the boat a little, it kind of got that anxiety heightening up. Kind of got that worry going. And it turned out we eventually tipped the boat. Now thankfully we were close to shore and it wasn't a big deal, but we got a little bit wet and so did our stuff, but everybody was okay. But there's something about water, there's something about wind, there's something about the unpredictableness of it all that for me gets me a little uncertain, gets me worried. It gets me scared, plain and simple. As much as I love it, when everything is smooth and everything is calm and everything is easy, as soon as it starts to get riled up a little, it gets a little terrifying for me. And unfortunately, I think life is a lot like a canoe trip sometimes. Sometimes you're with people who don't really know what they're doing. Sometimes you're with people who really do. Sometimes everything is steady and smooth and easygoing, and sometimes it's just not. And it seems like right now, the wind and the waves are crashing all around us. And not only are we not with somebody who knows what they're doing, we're alone, and sometimes we don't know what we're doing. Right now, as we're going through everything we're going through, to me, it's a lot like that experience I had in Algonquin Park. As much as I loved the experience and looking back on it, I can see all the good things. In the midst of it, I was scared. I was really scared. I was really anxious and worried, and I didn't know how it would turn out. Would we tip this boat or any of the boats at any point in time? At one point, it started to rain. We could see the clouds coming in, and we didn't know what was going to happen. Do we wait? Do we go? What's going to happen? Life is like that right now. We can see the clouds coming. We don't know what's going to happen. There's so much that's uncertain. But in the midst of that, we're still here. And so how do we hold on to ourselves, to hope, to not give up when it's so hard to do that right now. I think we can learn a lot from boats about this. In fact, one of the authors in Scripture has an analogy, a visual, that really hits home to me about this. One of the authors of Scripture, and I say that because I don't know who actually wrote this letter we're going to look at in a second, but whoever they were, when they wrote the letter of Hebrews to Jewish people, to people who understood their background, their culture, and everything that was so important to them, who started to follow Jesus, they wrote in such a way to really drive home an image that Jesus is where we can find hope. And not only that, is where we can hold on to hope when it's hard. But we have to practice that when things are tough. In the same way that when we're in a boat and it's rocking back and forth and we don't know what's happening and there's a storm coming, there are certain things we can do to be safe, to be secure. Doesn't mean we won't be scared. Doesn't mean the winds won't come, the waves won't crash. But it does mean we can be secure. He says there's certain things we need to do in our lives. So the author of Hebrews gives a picture related to boats on what we can do to hold on to hope when it's hard. And so the writer of Hebrews writes this in chapter 6, starting at verse 13. And Hebrews is a letter, a book in the Bible written to specific people, like I mentioned. And so there's a lot we can learn from it. We got to also remember that we aren't those people. So some of the images, some of the stuff that comes up might be confusing to us. And I know for me, this is one of the letters, the books in the Bible that I find the most hard to read because there's so much imagery, so much significance rooted in a people 2,000 years ago that I'm not a part of. And so I don't fully understand everything that's in here. But what I do get, what I do understand, is the author deeply wants me to understand and to know who Jesus is and why Jesus is the source of our hope in our life. And when the storm comes, what can we do to keep going forward and not lose hope? So the author of Hebrews in chapter 6 writes this, starting at verse 13. When God made his promise to Abraham, since there was no one greater for him to swear by, he swore by himself. So here's what the author is starting to do. He's putting things into a historical position. He's starting with Abraham. Some of us might be familiar with Scripture, and we know the story of Abraham starts in the beginning chapters of Genesis. In Genesis chapter 11, we're introduced to Abraham and his family. And then in chapter 12, God says, hey, I am going to bless you and you are going to be a blessing to all people. And that what we've learned from that, as we go through Scripture, we go through the Old Testament, people kept rooting themselves back into the family of Abraham. If you were with us last week as we were exploring some of the words of Peter to people who were non-Jewish, he too said, hey, you are part of this family too, rooting back to Abraham. So you and me, if we are followers of Jesus, even if we are not from a historical line, can find our story back into the story of Abraham and God and God's people. And so in Genesis, God is talking to Abraham and telling him what he's going to do, and then we see the story unfold of everything that happens to Abraham. One of the more significant stories, one of the ones that most of us remember, is that Abraham is asked to sacrifice his son, Isaac. And just as the moment is about to come where he is going to take away his son's life, God says, stop. You've proven your faithfulness. It was never about a sacrifice. And he provides a ram for a sacrifice. Now that's a very confusing story for a lot of us. And I know if you don't have a church background, if you haven't heard that before, you're thinking, what on earth is going on? Well, at the time of Abraham, it wasn't uncommon for people to have an expectation that God's, plural, would ask for your first child to be killed to them. And so what God does in that moment is he's not really asking for a sacrifice. He's trying to prove a point that he's not like all the other gods. In particular, a god named Molech, who expected people to sacrifice their children to him. And people did it. Now, the difference between those two gods is one is real, the God of Abraham, and one is one that the people associated with something that wasn't really true. And so God proved his point saying, I'm not like everybody else. I'm not like what people think God should be like. And so as he said to Abraham, I'm going to bless you and you are going to bless everybody else. Jew and Gentile would be a language of Old Testament. Everybody will be blessed through you. And so he's setting the stage. He's saying when God made his promise to Abraham that he would bless him and bless his descendants, he didn't swear by anyone else. He just did it. Because there was nobody greater than God to do that by. You know, sometimes we hear people say when they want to put like an exceptional amount of pressure on the point that they're making, saying, I swear to God. Well, God can't swear to God. God just swears by himself. That's the point he's making. It's like we seek out this higher power to say this is what we're swearing by, so it makes it more authentic, more serious, more real. But the author of Hebrews is saying that doesn't happen because God's the ultimate. So God just swears by himself. He's saying, I'm doing this, and that's it. He's trying to make the point that what God says, God does. And nobody is more powerful than God. So he continues. He says, when he swore by himself, saying, I will surely bless you and give you many descendants. And so after waiting patiently, Abraham received what was promised. And again, the story of Abraham goes that he made a lot of mistakes along the way. But through his son Isaac, who through his son Jacob, we see there's a line of people that have blessed the world who ultimately leads to Jesus. And so the author of Hebrews is pointing into this moment in history. When God spoke to Abraham, when God told Abraham, you will be a blessing because of your descendants, and it's going to be great. He kept his promise. Even though in the midst of those times, Abraham tried to do things to make the promise happen, which wasn't what he was supposed to do. Even though it looked like the promise was going to be broken by God, God did not break the promise. What God says he will do, he does. That's what the author is trying to point to here. He says, God is faithful. God is steadfast. He does not change. This is a theme that comes up over and over again in this book. God is the same as he was yesterday, today, and forever. No matter what's going on, God is constant. He continues. He says, people swear by someone greater than themselves, and the oath confirms what is said and puts an end to all arguments. Like I said before, we go, I swear to God. Or you go to court and they put your hand in the Bible, do you swear to tell the whole truth, nothing but the truth? Yeah, that's the picture they're giving. He's saying people put these things, the Bible, God, on my mother's grave, all these statements we make to try and prove what we're saying is the truth. He says people will always swear, kind of put an oath, say they're doing something by some higher standard, not just yes or no, which is something that Jesus taught. He said, let your yes be yes and your no by no. You don't have to swear by anything. Just be truthful and consistent. So he says people swear by someone greater than themselves, and the oath confirmed what is said and puts an end to this. Because God wanted to make the unchanging nature, that's key here, because God wanted to make the unchanging nature of his purpose very clear to the heirs of what was promised, he confirmed it with an oath. So he's saying because God wanted to make sure that we understood that what he says he does, and he doesn't change, he made it clear with an oath, meaning he made the promise and he's going to keep the promise. He's made a commitment, kind of a sign to say this is what is going to happen, and they seal it and say this is it. He doesn't swear by anyone else because nobody's greater than God. God just says, I'm going to do it, and I did it. But I'm going to make this commitment, this verbal commitment with you, to show you so that you have something to hold on to. God did this so that two unchangeable things in which it is impossible for God to lie. So two unchangeable things. So what exactly is the author of Hebrews saying here? So God did this. God made this promise to Abraham. God made this oath so that two things would be evident. Here are the two things. God doesn't change. God keeps his promises. He said these two things he is. So these two things, God doesn't change, God keeps his promises, are consistent. They do not change. He says by two unchangeable things. So we who have fled to take hold of the hope set before us may be greatly encouraged. So God did this so that two unchangeable things. God does not change. God keeps his promises, in which it is impossible for God to lie. We who have fled take hold of the hope set before us may be greatly encouraged. Because we can hold on to the truth that God is the same yesterday, today, and tomorrow. The God of Abraham is the God of us. And because he made a promise to Abraham and he kept it, he has demonstrated through history that over and over again, what he says he's going to do, he does. We can hold on to that and have hope. We can hold on and have hope. We don't have to be hopeless. The God of hope, the God who invited us to participate, the God who we know through Jesus, who the hope set before him went to the cross for us, does not change and keeps his promises. And nothing is going to change that. So it says, we have this hope as an anchor for the soul, firm and secure. It enters the inner sanctuary behind the curtain, where our forerunner Jesus has entered on our behalf. We have this hope as an anchor for the soul, firm and secure. Think about that image, okay? What does an anchor do? Well, an anchor, you throw it off a boat and it keeps you steady, right? He says, we have this hope. We have this faith. We have this understanding. It's not a blind faith. It's not a, well, I think it's going to turn out kind of faith. It's a, God is God. God does not change, and God keeps his promises, so I have hope. It's not rooted in ideals. It's not rooted in fantasy. It's rooted in the reality that God has not changed, and we can trust that. And God has made promises, and he has kept them, so we can trust that. So the same promises he has given for people throughout time, and he's given to us, we can trust. And because of that, we can have hope that is rooted like an anchor. Now think about that, okay? So say we have an anchor like this, okay? So this is from my friend Peter's boat, and Peter loaned me this anchor. And maybe we've seen like some comedies or kid shows, like I see this on kid shows all the time, where there's something going on and they're worried about the water, right? You know, the waves are crashing and they're going all over the place. They don't know what's going to happen. And so someone's like, okay, drop the anchor. So they drop the anchor. But they forget to hold on to the rope. Well, what happens? Usually in a comedy, they're like, oh, what did you do? Or a Disney show or something like that. But imagine that. Imagine you're out at the sea. Maybe, you're on a sailboat. And maybe things start to get a little bit chaotic. And you know that if you just keep going, it'll just get worse. So you've got to stay still. You got to stop as best as possible and wait out the storm. So you go to drop an anchor, but you don't hold on to the rope or it's not attached. Well, you're still going to get pushed around by those waves. You're still going to go up and down, and you're still going to get seasick, and probably you're going to sink. You've got to hold on to that anchor. And so the author of Hebrews is saying, look at this picture. Imagine you're out at sea. Imagine your life is like you on a boat, and there's waves crashing, and there's wind blowing, and you don't know what to do. Well, you got to stay still, because if you go further into sea, it might get even worse. So you got to drop the anchor. The anchor is useless if you just keep it on the boat. So you've got to let it do what it's always been meant to do. And so in the same way, we have to allow our faith to do what it was always meant to do. Hold us still. But if we're not holding onto that rope of the anchor, we can be tossed and turned all over. An anchor is useless if we're not going to use it. And our faith, if we're not practicing it, if we're not trusting that the God who made promises to Abraham has made promises to us and is going to keep them, then it's like we let go of the rope. And it's not really going to help us. You have to hold on to what you know to be true. When things seem uncertain, when things seem like everything is crashing in, you've got to hold on to what you know to be true. If you allow your emotions, your fear, your anxiety to guide you the whole time, you will be like a ship tossed in the waves. You've got to hold on to the anchor. What is really true? In our experiences, there's a lot of times where we feel like we're being tossed around with waves. Maybe we got that phone call from the doctor we never wanted to get. Maybe that friend who we trusted betrayed our trust. Maybe that job that was helping us just get by is lost because of COVID-19. There's all kinds of things going on in our lives. And it seems like we're being tossed to and from. You've got to drop the anchor and hold on. Make sure it's attached. You've got to let your hope take hold and be steadfast in God. No matter what is going on around you, no matter when schools are going to open or jobs are going to reopen or when those stimulus checks are going to come in, there's one thing constant, and it never changes. God. And the God who was present with Abraham is present with you. And because of Jesus, you can know that hope and let that hope be an anchor to your soul to keep you in times like this when hope is hard, steady. Now, it doesn't mean that it's going to stop the waves from crashing in or the wind from blowing. It just means God is there with you and you can weather the storm. Sometimes when we want things to be different, we want God to stop those winds and stop those waves, we don't understand why he doesn't. And I wish I had an answer, and I wish I could say, well, this is why, or that is why, or this is why your prayers were answered, or they weren't answered, but I don't know. God is not a magical genie who just does whatever we want. God is constant. God is just. God is loving. And God is there. And just because he doesn't do what you think is best does not mean he is not working for your best in the end. And you need to hold on to that anchor. Let it go, be rooted, and keep you secure while the waves are crashing in, while the wind is blowing, and you don't know what's going to happen next. The God who loves you is the same yesterday, today, and forever. He is steadfast. He is with you. And when hope is hard, he is your anchor if you let him be.
I will build my house, whether storm or drought, on the rock that does not move. I will set my hope in your love, O Lord, and your faithfulness will prove. You are steadfast, steadfast by the word you spoke, all the starry hosts are called out by name each night. In your watchful care, I will rest secure as you lead us with your light. You are steadfast, steadfast. You are steadfast, steadfast. I will not trust in the strength of kings. On your promise I will stand. I will shout for joy. I will raise my voice. Hallelujah to the Lamb. You are steadfast, steadfast. You are steadfast, steadfast. In the moment of emptiness, all was fulfilled. In the hour of darkness, your light was revealed. In the presence of death, your life was affirmed. In the absence of holiness, you are still God. You are steadfast, steadfast. You are steadfast, steadfast.